Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle Finance Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, Matt Pileski, Regional Chief Financial Officer at Arthur J. Gallagher. We're excited to have Matt with us for a keynote titled Linking Storytelling to Strategy for Success. Welcome, Matt, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Britt. Very happy to be here today, and I want to share basically like how we link storytelling to strategy. And I think so. A little bit about me. I work for Arthur Gallagher, been there for 17 years, and I work in the financial planning and analysis in both mergers and acquisitions areas. So what we're frequently trying to do is get our salespeople to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it. And we typically have to put that in the form of story to get them to do it. I kind of wanted to share some of the science of how we do that. Let's see. So first, our challenges, and we kind of want to go through what's the difference between strategy and execution, how you make solid recommendations, and how you convert those solid recommendations into insightful, compelling, and persuasive stories to really bring your leaders to action. And so looking at kind of like what our challenges are, well, everybody knows that finance is getting pushed to do things faster and faster, do more with AI, do everything, and then they always want us to be strategic. And a little story, earlier in my career, when I was getting my MBA at University of Chicago Booth, we took strategy class and everybody thought it was very intuitive. It's like, well, this is common sense. Like, what's so difficult about strategy? And a couple of years later, I was in a role where maybe, probably didn't like that. So then people started saying, well, Matt can't think strategically. And it's like, well, what does that even mean? And I sit there. And so I've done a lot of studying of strategy. And like, even as I push down some of this, well, what is strategy? And it's really, the easiest way to say it when you look at it is how we allocate resources, but it's a desired pattern of decision making to help us make decisions and allocate those resources. And it's also should be a roadmap to help people, what actions should we take, should we not take, and things that we should prioritize and not prioritize. And to me, this is Harvard Business Review, it's the definition, but it's really very squishy. And that's why it's like when we try to, they're always saying, well, finance should be strategic, but what actually does it mean? And this does kind of seem like some common sense. And then you look at high level, here's our mission and goals, the what, how we link the what, the how, the why, the who, all these things. And it's like, okay, so what does really being strategic mean? So let me tell you kind of, well, as I simplify this down to kind of where I work, Arthur Gallagher, well, we're in the insurance brokerage industry. And what do? What's our strategy? Well, we're in a consolidating industry. So we're putting all these other brokers on our platform. We're one of the big consolidators, and we have a competitive advantage where we can do things, because we've invested, made all these technology investments into our single platform. So our platform, we can run cheaper and we get economies of scale as we do it. And as we put people on, that's what we do. So what strategy is not, I think this is also very important, and this will become a theme throughout this presentation, is execution. And so the execution of the strategy, and this is like, okay, so we have a competitive advantage. We find our partners. We never do anything alone. We work hard, and that helps us get economies of scale. How we execute that is not strategy itself. So one of the things I want to differentiate between is when we get these requests, well, what's a change in strategy when they're making a request to us, usually for resource allocation, versus what's actually helping us execute the strategy. And if you can differentiate between those two things, I think that really helps you a lot. as you sit here and you craft your expertise of like, well, how does finance help us be strategic? We need to differentiate between what's a change in strategy versus what's just execution of that strategy. So how do we typically measure things? And I don't know about you, but everybody always wants to see the P&L. And I look at this P&L and then I'm like, okay, how do I link this to strategy? Because it's like, what happens is when somebody wants to have a resource allocation, they say, let me see my P&L. And when you look at the P&L, well, what on here tells me if I like, look, I see I make kind of a nice margin here, 35.7. I see I got growth, I got all this stuff. But how does it tell me if it's a good investment or not, and if it's in line with strategy or not? It just tells you, here's how much profitability. And like, look, we don't really want to manage our P&L to kind of manufacture things. We want to allocate resources to help us be more efficient and do other things. So I try to always downplay the P&L when I'm trying to figure out, well, how do I manage my business unit leaders? So if I'm not using the P&L, how am I being insightful? And I like to use kind of an analogy of like, look, with the chiropractor, looking for the trigger points. I don't need to know everything. We just need to find the key points that we need to hit on. So a lot of times people work for me, they want to spend all their time saying, well, look, here's how I accumulated the data. Here's all the work we put in to figure out precisely what the number is. And of course, when then someone doesn't like the number, then we go reperform it. And what do you know? It kind of comes up, it's kind of similar. And we keep on like hoping if we just keep on cranking out the numbers, we're going to come to a different number. But the reality is, what we really need to know is, well, what are those points where we take action, where we would actually drive strategy? So if you look at here, I think what we all need to know is what our business models are and what our targets are and what our levers are. So when you look at the targets, it's like, it's real. When I do a budget, I'm more just looking at, well, how much growth do I want to grow? Let's say I want to get 10% growth. And let's say I want to do it better. So I want to get a 0.5 point margin improvement. So when I'm speaking to my leaders, like, look, if I tell them they got to hit a number and it's like, look, then it's like, well, you compiled the budget the wrong way, or we don't like the budget. But when I tell them like, look, you got to think about this. How am I growing my revenues? How are we going to accomplish that? And how do I do it while accomplishing getting more efficient? Now we can ask, well, like, this is more conceptual. People can understand it. So what are the levers that we use to hit kind of this? Is you got to know them. It's like, okay, I mean, there's really only a couple things. You don't have to look at the whole P&L. You look at, here's the commissions and fees. Here's my new loss, due and loss. What do we pay on those? Here's my producer compensation. What do I pay in renewal? What do I pay in my growth? So these are things that like, okay, how do I drive changes in my revenues, in my variable compensation, and my fixed compensation? Because when you look at those things, if you know those things and what the inputs into them, then you can kind of figure out, well, how do I make my investment request within a way that will fit the whole budget? So now let's shift to how we're being influential and being compelling. So look, when you confuse, you lose. Noise is the enemy. So anything that's not linked to strategy, when we get lots of requests, is just noise. It's like, okay, tell us how you allocate this. Tell me how you calculate this. There's always, how do you calculate home office? How do you do this? How did this get allocated? But the reality is that has nothing to do with resource allocation or strategy. It's just who pays for it. And the reality is what we want to do is make sure we're using our resources more efficiently in line with our strategy. So getting your story right is the best way to grow your business. Keep them online with those drivers on the last page, because it seems like that's never what they want to talk about. They want to talk about, well, how the numbers were calculated and how it wasn't fair, when the reality is we just need to figure out, well, how are we doing better? How are we increasing our revenue growth? How are we becoming more efficient? How are we driving margin growth? So then as we go into these stories, like, this is a good framework that I like to use. Is it simple? Add a little bit of, is it unexpected? Is it concrete? These are where we've always bring in the numbers. Is it credible? Bring in a little emotion, bring in some fear, and then bring in some stories. That's how we really can be more compelling. So getting credibility into your stories, and this is the whole garbage in, garbage out. So what's the tips to statistics in your stories? Like, the statistical method should enable data to answer specific questions. They always come with the noise. So let's try to eliminate the noise. That's from Nate Silver. Plan ahead, really ahead, avoid researchers' degree of freedom. So don't just give them confirmation bias, like where we knew the numbers before we even started. Make sure you get your data quality right. Statistical analysis more than a set of computations. Know why you're using a formula, and if it's the right formula, keep it simple. Do not show off skills, provide assessment, check your assumptions, make sure it's replicable. So it's like, look, you got to get the right data or else you won't have credibility and you won't make good recommendations, but you can make some estimates in here. So is storytelling easy? No, and I think this is really interesting. It's from Ed Catmull, who's the former CEO of Disney Pixar. And he basically said, like, look, these are movies that they make because early on, all of our movies suck. That's a blunt assessment, I know, but I make a point of repeating it often. And I choose that phrasing because saying it in a softer way fails to convey how bad the first versions of our films really are. So if we spend as much time getting the stories right as we do closing the books, we can create more compelling stories. So here, how do we create a simple story formula? I think the thing that we need to make sure is once upon a time, this is a formula, once upon there was a character. That character encountered a problem. The character meets a guide, the guide gives them a plan, the characters take action that helps them avoid failure and ends in a success. So if we take this into kind of, hey, here's a real life scenario that happens to us, it's always about money. There's a department that comes to us and they're like, oh, we have a problem. Maybe we can fix it with just throwing money at the problem. So then they'll come to us and they'll say, well, can we have more money? So I think what our job is to go back to them and then act as a guide. We don't just say no. We say, okay, how do we help you develop a plan? How do we do some analysis on your plan to show, well, how you're going to develop return on investment? So we're going to give them a plan. Then the character, if they follow the plan, look, what we try to do is then keep everything systematic. So keep your request on cycle, because if you keep your request on cycle, then we don't go first in, first out for requests, and they each, but then you can kind of rank them in terms of the order that they come in and make sure, hey, these are the ones, let's be more deliberate in our actions, let's keep things on cycle, and let's really get it within a framework so we can evaluate all the requests equally, and then you can get a fair process that ends in, you know, us investing money that ends in success. Okay, so setting. The setting obviously is the time and place of your story. And when you're doing this from finance, it's best to kind of look at it in terms of when the business cycle is. So if you're in the beginning cycle, if you're a mature industry, look at where you are. But even when you are in it, what you want to do is kind of avoid even setting the story where we're going to be in decline, because everybody wants something to look forward to. So like say, hey, like you might want to show that, hey, there's some headwinds coming ahead that we have to overcome, but here's how we're going to do it. And here's how we're just getting started. Here's how we're going to end up with growth. But add all your financial metrics into your setting of the story. Make sure you get that right. Okay. The characters in the story. And I think what's important here is you have many characters. You have a protagonist who's the hero. You have an antagonist who's typically your villain. You may have a love interest who they're going after. You have a confidant or guide, like the person you look here. It's probably Yoga in Star Wars. You have your side characters who maybe spin off into their own story. You have your tertiary characters, supporting cast members who aren't really there. And then you have a foil who's a competitive to the protagonist, but maybe not the villain. So you get all these people in here, and then it's like, well, how do I make my story crisp and make sure you got all these characters? But we always want to position ourselves as the guide. You do not want to be the protagonist. Finance can't be the hero of the story, because then it just gets to be about hitting numbers as opposed to the people who actually hit the numbers. It's always about the people that do it. And we just interpret that and then try to get some insight on how to do it better. Okay. Point of view perspective taking. And I think this is another thing, like we like to compile standard reports. and just give the same report out. And what happens is different departments will definitely have different views of the story. So you want to show different angles. And here's a couple of examples here. We look at the picture here. It's like, look, it's the exact same picture. But when you're looking at from the land, you're saying, oh my God, there's a boat. But when you're in the boat, you're looking at land. So depending on which way you're looking, you see different things. And we may want to present our numbers from different angles because, look, different departments, we always want to make them the protagonist of the story, and showing the exact same thing, you're going to be less influential. So show it from their point of view, understand their point of view, and you basically got to understand it before you get there. Same thing with this underwater versus overwater. Depending on which way you look at it, if you're underwater, you see one thing. If you're overwater, you see another thing. It's the same thing. They're the same numbers, but depending on how you present them, I've been told by my staff, it's like, why do we have to present it in 3 different ways? Well, because 3 different people are going to see it 3 different ways. And our point is to be influential. It's not just to let them read it and come to their own conclusions. We need to kind of point them in the right way that helps them make decisions in line with strategy. Okay. So the conflict in the pot, it's always a tug of war over dollars. And here you're thinking, okay, well, how do I get my resource or my calculation right? The pot is sitting here, and like these are the things that change over time. And again, you want to link this back to, okay, is it a change in strategy? Like we bought this company and they told us, hey, here's the things we do. And then all of a sudden, they're a little bit different than what we thought they were going to be. Well, that's a change in strategy. There's going to be a slower approval process when you change the strategy. When it's like, okay, here's the things we thought you were going to do. We just need, we need some replacement hires to keep doing what we're doing. Those approvals go quicker. So always putting things in context of, hey, is it change in strategy, or is it just helping us execute the strategy better? Those are very, very helpful. This is, I think, another formula to stories that I think is really helpful. So the buyer's formula: introduce an idea, establishing yourself as an expert. And we all are experts. We know all these numbers. We see these numbers all the time. We're very familiar with them. And then after you've been doing it a while, here's some obvious ways to fail. I mean, obviously, if your costs are growing faster than your revenues, that's a quick way to failure. That's pretty obvious. But then you can highlight some counterintuitive ways to fail. And that may be like, look, we don't have the people arranged the right way. Here's some things we could do to change our structure more effectively. There may be some things that are hidden in the numbers that you don't actually see. So then you say like, well, look, obviously you need to take some obvious action. It can be like, look, we could need to increase our sales. That would be obvious. Then there's some less obvious things you could do, like hit this segment, which would be something you would do. But as you're going to go through the numbers, you always want to hand over autonomy. Again, this has to do with your end user being the protagonist of the story. It's about them, not you. Tell them, here's what I would do, but I'm not your boss. I'm just providing you information. You can do whatever you want. This helps you redirect, to establish some boundaries. And like when they say, when they want to get offline, then you could say, people always worry about that. But the truth is, there's 25 things to worry about. Here's the 3 to 5 that you should worry about. And let's make sure we get that in the context. But I think thinking of your end consumer as a buyer, and you're trying to give them information and then use those, really do the choice architecture to get it right and frame it into your story that way, that's very important. Okay. The other thing too is, look, the tragedy's winter is coming. I think I hear a lot, we've always done it that way, so there's no need to change. And the reality is that's like saying in August, it's 75 degrees outside. So there's no reason to think in December, it's going to change to winter. Winter always comes. The business cycle always happens. And if you don't prepare for it, you're going to get, so make sure you build that into your story of saying, hey, here's some things, pure optimism. If you just think everything's great and you're complacent, it just drives a lack of action. So don't be too optimistic, because there's always risk in the numbers, and it's our job to point out the risks and really drive people. Unfortunately, pessimism does sell. It provides an alternative point to consider before making a decision. So failure to act has consequences. You always want to make sure, hey, let's make sure we're playing the winner is coming script. Okay. And then this is another one that I find, because everyone always thinks that everything's linear. And it's like, okay, if I grew 7% last month, it should be 7% the next month and 7% after. But a lot of times there's a lag between when you take action and when the results always lag action. So this is one of the frequent analogies we like to make, is that, look, ice always melts at 32 degrees. Water always boils at 212. But what happens between 32 and 212? I mean, if you're at 38 degrees, you'll be sitting there making progress on something. The temperature will drop from 38 to 36. Then you keep doing it. Nobody really sees anything. Nothing changes. We go from 36 to 34. Then nobody sees anything. Go 34 to 32. Bam. Now all of a sudden, we have this huge change. And it's like, well, what really changed? Everybody looks at your monthly P&L that happened that month, not realizing that it all popped in 1 month, but it was really months of work that got it to get there. I love using the phase transitions analogy, because that really helps you figure out, well, how do we change things? They don't happen linearly. Okay. Simple model, the forest and the trees. This is another one, because when you're looking top down at your business, you're really looking top down at the forest view. And the problem is, everyone always says, well, my business is different. Look at my tree. My tree looks a little bit different. And so this comes to a story like, look, this is percolation theory. When you're looking at it, it's like they figured out how to prevent forest fires by managing the forest. And then they went to the forest fires who did this, who monitor it, and they just rejected the theory, because they go, well, you don't really understand. This tree grows this way, this tree grows that way. You can't really look at it at a macro level. And then what happened? Well, then once there was a really big fire, burned down a bunch of trees, and then they started to realize, oh, maybe we should apply the science. So things that happen at the macro level, you got to be able to bring it down and relate it to the micro level. And the more you can keep a simple model of saying, here's how it relates, here's how it fits in, it's very important to understand the difference between these two things. Okay. Then finally, key takeaways here. Know your strategy and how to measure it against it and when things might change. Know your protagonist and position yourself as a guide. Know the context and the story setting by being up to date on data trends, as well as insights from the business through conversations. People take action when there is pessimism. Drive action with the winner is coming script, coupled with upside to taking action. Use the story templates to inspire, and eliminate unnecessary noise from your stories while keeping both supporting and unsupporting data. So thank you, and I think we can open it up to any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for such a great keynote presentation. As a reminder, the audience can still enter questions. We'll go ahead and review some of the questions that came through. Matt, this first question asks, how do you teach how to build the data to tell the story, especially if you were to grab the wrong data and that would tell the wrong story?
Well, I think one of the things with building the data, I think you want to keep it consistent. So one of the things is always keeping it on 12-month rolling numbers, or even ACT-5, making sure we have, because then the numbers stay consistent and then you can measure improvement. And then you just need to make sure that, hey, you are, grabbing the right data, and it's really kind of familiarity with it. The more familiar with it you are, the less likely you are to pull the wrong data. But I think keeping the metrics consistent month to month makes a big difference there.
Great, thank you. This next question, should you start with an estimate of your number to make your data more credible?
I think, this is where it's saying, I think, yes, having a hypothesis before you start, which you could say is an estimate. It's like, look, we think it's going to be this. Then you have something to measure against. And then you can say, hey, are we beating our target? Are we decreasing it? And then kind of knowing, always knowing why, and saying, hey, that's the key, is knowing why it is what it is versus what the expectation was.
Perfect, thank you. And how do you help develop the storytelling approach for your team?
I think here's where there's two things that really help with this is practice. because I think a lot of team members are very comfortable, hey, just presenting the numbers and saying, hey, doesn't the numbers speak for themselves? So I think one, you got to make them practice it, because the more you practice it, you realize the data doesn't speak for itself. And then two, visualization. So the more you can use graphs, charts, like anything that helps people visualize it, so you don't have to actually explain it yourself and get the story kind of started with a picture, that would be the two things.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have time for a couple more questions. Creating storytelling dashboards can be very time consuming without having a good data structure. So from your experience, how can you reduce the time it takes to clean the data and create a new report?
I think a lot of times, look, you got to craft your strategy a little bit without the data, and then have the data support the story. Because if you're trying to there is noise within the data. So it's like, okay, you got to start with your story and then say, hey, does my data support it? Does it refute it, and adjust it from that? But if you build your story first and then put the data to support it, that goes better than just kind of, because what we found is when we just do dashboards and it's just the same numbers time after time, the data can then contradict itself and you don't even actually have the story. So figuring out how to get the data to support as opposed to just showing a pure dashboard is my recommendation.
Great, thank you, Matt. And we have one last question. What new roles or responsibilities have CFOs and their teams taken on, and how does storytelling apply to these?
Well, I think, look, there is much, we're going digital. We're trying to be more forward looking as opposed to just, we've really got to understand the business and the change, and then we got to explain the numbers that go into it. So I think being able to communicate through stories is just one of the most effective ways to get people to remember what you're doing. And it just builds you credibility because it shows you understand stuff. You can craft a story that connects. So I think that's where it's like sometimes we say, hey, we got to tell stories, but we got to have data to support them to show that, hey, we do own the numbers.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Matt, for such an incredible keynote presentation. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following this event. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.